Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about Blood and Bone, and we're still in Raf not having proper beer land. It'll probably stay a while like that because right now I don't have a chance to get maybe over the weekend. We'll see. Anyway, my voice is slowly coming back. It's still a bit gnarly, but we'll see how long that will go. We're here to talk about the next two chapters, those being chapters 3 and 4 of Blood and Bone. Today, I hope I can get through this without getting all confused, and before I have to go to another festival meeting thing. We'll see if that all works out. Anyways, until then, I'll just start, I guess. Cheers. All right. So, the first thing I want to talk about here today is the chapter epitaphs, right? So we start like epigraphs, not epitaphs. What an idiot I am. The chapter epigraphs, and this time around they're all quotes, or almost all quotes, from travelogues or supposed travelogues or other books about Jakaruku. And they're all wildly exaggerated. And I feel it's important to look at that because, once again, this, in a way, pays homage or subverts or whatever, shines a light on such travelogues and the effect they can have, the exoticism in them, right? So I don't know how many of you have read any of those kind of books that we have about like our search for, like, it's a thing from like mostly the 17th 18th century when a lot of people went to all kinds of places in mostly the Americas or in Africa or in Asia, South Asia mostly, and returned with like very tall tales of how things were where they went. Now obviously the classic in that regard is older, would be Marco Polo's travels, or account of his travels to China, basically, which I can tell you from reading some of it actually is worth reading. It's fun, it's interesting, and it's completely ridiculous. Then you have your John Mandeville, who invented the entire shit show that he like claimed. So the story of Europeans traveling somewhere, not understanding what they are seeing, coming back and telling a story about it is an old one. It's one that we've it's an old genre. And the things that we recognize when we read those kind of things, whether it's from the Middle Ages or like the Enlightenment, or even like the 19th century, where we still have some of those that get more and more personal and less like an actual guidebook to an exotic place, is that their perspective is extremely Western mostly. In our, I mean, probably there are such tales or such books from, say, Asian travelers who travel to Europe, but I have not read those. But like they usually, their viewpoint, their focus is extremely like one directional. It's very much that person going to some place, looking at all the noble savages or not so noble savages, and so forth, and glorifying whatever kind of mass murder and exploitation they were actually, perpetuating at the place that they're writing about. And we see the same thing here, and I feel it's a clear subversion or like comment on that form of literature that we see in those epigraphs. So I just wanted to point that out. Especially one struck me. That's the one for chapter 4. No, even chapter 5 that I just listened to before I switched off my my phone. That's all about how unwilling the natives were to actually work. Because, well, they were fucking enslaved is why. Yeah. That's the kind of thing that those epigraphs show us, and it gives us a perspective on what we can, like, a lens through which we can read or look at Blood and Bone and the continent of Jakaruku, who does in a lot of ways resemble or like you know, resemble or uh, you know, resembles the word that I was looking for. Both like all those exotic jungles, whether it is, I mean, it's like the epitome of like the epitome of a jungle. It's a bit of India, it's a bit of South America, it's a bit of Africa, it's even a bit of like Australia, I guess, when you have all the jokes about all the terrible, terrible snakes and spiders and all of that. But yeah, and how we still look at those places, and even in our modern day, because our modern media portraying these places is, well, partly better, I guess, but only partly. We still have that very colonial view of some parts. Now, you could argue that maybe jungles are like the last remnant of that thing, right? That's sort of where we still look at as the other, which is the next thing that we need to talk about, the othering and so forth. Because once again, the jungle is the other, and those who dwell within the jungle are sort of part of that other. And it's like that gigantic other of like everyone versus the jungle, basically, and the people or the beings that live in there. And what Cam Esslemont does is when he calls it Himatan, which is Ardata's realm, which is actually literally in another world, or at least partly its own warren, or in the spirit world, or whatever. He actually manifests that othering on like another, like a more literal level than just saying we look at the jungle as the other. And that can help us understand, maybe in a way, how we deal with othering. It is, interestingly enough, in a conversation between Sauer and Merc, when they're talking about the difference between a forest and the jungle, right? It's like, yeah, it's the thing that we fear, and that's why we want to chop it down. But maybe the people that actually live there don't fear it. They actually call it home. So it's still our perspective that looks at these places and turns them into something frightful, something fearful, something other. And those inhabitants, by association, also into something other. And being the kind of people that we are, we tend to destroy what we are afraid of. It's sort of one of our reflexes. It's that fight or flight reflex. And as a species, humans at some point decide that fight is better than flight. So yeah. So that is an interesting aspect. The other part is that conversation that Merc has with the fragment of the crippled god, that girl, Celeste. And it's like, I didn't have a name. Because why would you... because a name distances you from the other, but you're part of the other. There is no other. That's an interesting statement right there, because defining ourselves as separate from the other is very much about very much a part of becoming a person at this point. I feel it's like that's like when you discover or like develop the self, right? So we need to find a way between developing a self and building up that border between ourselves and the rest of the universe, without then going to the trouble of making the rest of the world the other, the thing to be feared, the thing to be fought, to be hated, and so forth. That's the challenge of growing up as a human being in general. And we, as a species, we haven't been really good at it. Now, with the jungle as the other, and we just call it the entire realms, like, we as human beings are still pretty fucking weak bastards, right? We've developed a lot of technology to destroy and whatnot our planet. That's worked out relatively well. But places like the jungle, I guess, technically also stuff like, say, the ice plateaus and Antarctica and stuff like that, and some parts of the desert, those are the points where we still are completely powerless on a general level, right? And we feel that, so that those places trigger that fear of the other far more than, say, a forest in a more temperate zone, like, I don't know, Germany or whatever. Also, we've been doing terrible things to our forests for like thousands of years. But the point is, while earthquakes or, huge fires or tsunamis or whatever have, like, also have that power of showing us our, like, species-wide insignificance versus the forces of nature. They are like singular events. They happen, and then we pick up our pieces and try to survive and whatnot. But places like jungles, places like deserts, places like the ice caps, well, until they start melting, but that's a different point, is that, or we chop them down. Places like that are a permanent reminder. They're a permanent reminder that we don't really rule the planet fully, and thus a challenge to us as a species. So what we do is we go and try to destroy them. We chop down those forests. We do all kinds of other terrible things to them because they are a continuous challenge, because they're an other that we can't fully ignore. So there's that. And speaking of which, Cam Esslemont is extremely good at making the jungle be that other, right? We have, whether it's the group on the river with Shimmer and Kaaz and so forth, or the Thaumaturgs and that group and that army. The way this jungle feels alive and just like implacable, just taking everything down, rusting every single bit of iron, moldering the tent cloth, all those aspects, like, this is a level of making us the reader, making us the readers feel how alien a world, or inhospitable at least, like, or incompatible to a, what you might call, civilized world, or like lifestyle those places are. You can't go into a jungle with technology and just build a house and live there like you would live on a hill in, I don't know, the green and pleasant land of England. That will not work. That shit will break down immediately. So these are places where humans are forced to adapt, and not where humans can make or adapt the world to their lifestyle. And that's sort of the thing that Blood and Bone really rams home in a brutal way. Plus, when you look at especially the Thaumaturg army, and the beginning, when he's reading that, it's on point in chapter 3, I think, when the Thaumaturg is reading that other travel logs, like, because he comes from a position of almost absolute power and control in a civilized, very much human-dominated world, it is impossible for him to actually imagine that there are places where that is not the case. So what he does, and this is the critical thing there, is like, he just discards that travelogue or survivor's tale as false and as a lie. Now, is that the case? We will see. We certainly found out that Ardata's realm and, Himatan is a really weird place where things happen or things are possible that are not possible in other places. But that's something that we'll learn way more in the coming chapters. Just saying. But yeah, so that's like one of the big chunks of these two chapters that I wanted to look at. The next part is still like jungly jungle things with the group of the Crimson Guard on that riverboat. I like that passage. I mean, that's sort of where the whole like Heart of Darkness Apocalypse Now kind of vibe comes in. Well, in one case, I guess the other part where it's also very Apocalypse Now or Platoon, or that's an interesting aspect we can talk about in a second, right? But the river travel up into that place. And one thing that is important about rivers is rivers have always been, obviously, images or metaphors for the flowing of time, right? You talk about the river of time and all of that stuff. And they're traveling up the river. that means it's basically time travel into your past, or in the past, into the past of the river, because you're traveling against the actual flow of time, or in this case of water. And that meshes, and like that theme I feel is important. It's important on several levels. On one hand, we learn that Ardata's realm, where this river comes from, is sort of the past. It's holding on to the past. It gives room to all kinds of beings that have been hunted or killed or just pushed out of existence through time by humans and other, I guess, species on Wu. So there's that level of this being a time travel into the past, which kind of, meshes with that idea of all these like lost world kind of stories that were so popular in like the 1920s, 1930s, and so forth. The idea that you travel through the jungle and suddenly you find this place where even dinosaurs are still around. It feels like that. Like jungles oftentimes feel prehistoric just through their sheer like force of nature kind of thing. But yeah, with that idea of traveling up that river into the past, I mean, it's a metaphor that has been made by a lot of people. It's just like done really well here. Plus, you have that really weird psychedelic dreamlight quality of the entire thing. The next important bit, though, is that we are kind of doing the same thing. Well, the Crimson Guard is kind of doing the same thing, right? Because there's obviously something going on with the Crimson Guard. No one really knows what. I mean, there have been hints ever since the first time they show up in Return of the Crimson Guard. But we haven't really, I obviously know because I've read the rest of the books, but it is not yet fully clear. But what is clear is that something is wrong with the Crimson Guard, and it all kind of connects to the vow they made when they made the vow. That's sort of their birthplace, their wellspring where the Crimson Guard starts. And everything that happens in this book kind of points to that they need to rediscover, or well, Kaz probably also knows, but Kaz is saying like later. So they are traveling back in time, sort of, to that point where the Crimson Guard was born, and where whatever went wrong or right, or whatever, happened. So you have that on like a personal level as well, that kind of trip back into the past in a way, or at least back to that wellspring where the whole Crimson Guard history kind of started. So that's another thing that I wanted to look at. Yes, a quick one is like Apocalypse Now, kind of, and then I wanted to say Platoon and stuff like that, but I just wanted to point out that it's interesting in how much, even for someone who is not an American, how much the Vietnam War and its cultural heritage have like influenced our like way of viewing the world in the West. But it's like we see soldiers run through a jungle, through an actual jungle. At least my first association is like, I've seen a bunch of Vietnam movies, and it feels like that in a way, which I guess is sort of deliberate, just as at this point, if we see desert war in deserts, we probably think Iraq. And no longer Lawrence of Arabia, which is good and bad at the same time, I suppose. But yeah, that was just like a quick aside that I just like noticed while I was talking about, like that all my jungle warfare ideas are all, have all been like influenced by Vietnam stuff. Way to go, America, with your cultural hegemony. All right, what else was important to talk about in this book? Well, I feel the interesting bit about especially the story of Cyan and her brother and their travel into the wild there is that we see more and more elements of how inhuman and how other and weird that place Himatan is. And I mean this like on a general level. This is way beyond what we get in most like standard fantasy books. I mean, most standard fantasy books just don't go into the jungle. Sword and sorcery stories kind of do, at least some of them do, and they are already kind of going, but their jungle usually kind of feels tame. I feel the closest when it comes to the alienness of the beings in there and all of that stuff, the closest we get to it is some of the Clark Ashton Smith stories with Planet of Deadly Flowers and, you know, that kind of stuff. With the meeting between Zayan and Old Man Moon and all of that stuff. Like, this is the whole part of the jungle has this weird fevered quality to it that in imagination and possibilities that like it's hard to describe that. It's like you read these parts and you read the parts of Shimmer on the river and that part's like you can feel how the heat and the rain and all the craziness is slowing you down, it's slowing everyone down, it's slowing I can almost feel it on a visceral level that I rarely feel with books. So that's just like plain insane good writing there. Just saying. All right, another part that I feel is important is the idea of class within this book and economic power and whatnot. Because what we have here is we have a lot of like highly privileged actors in this book. We have obviously the Crimson Guard, who are privileged because most of them are, you know, former nobility or what have you. Also, they're like mercenaries and whatnot. They are powerful on levels that most other players in this world are not. Then we have our magus, our thaumaturg, who is by definition of the aristocracy. And we have our Prince Jatal, who is, while minor nobility or whatever you want to call it, is still nobility. So it's important to look at the characters that we meet here that are not part of that. And it's, you know, even though, say, Merc and Sour are not nobility, they're soldiers, now mercenaries or whatever. They're also outside of the bounds of like a class society. But Zayan is not. Zayan very much is not. And Jack, the bandit boy, is also not. And it's important to see that, especially with Jack, you have that situation where you realize that that sort of society, like the thaumaturg one, just breeds class hatred, which will, in this case, lead Jack to probably kill everyone. We'll see where that is going. At least that's his plans. Like, if you disenfranchise a large enough group of people, at some point that large group of people will fight back. And they won't be gentle because you've disenfranchised them. And disenfranchising people is, yeah, well, it's morally wrong, but it's also just like a recipe for disaster. So I just wanted to look at that real quick because, you know, I think it's important to see that that's another dimension that we have here. Another thing that I find interesting, and we'll probably come back to it, I just remembered that I thought it earlier today, so I want to put it out now. It's once again global perspective, right? Jakaruku is, like, in Malazan terms, at the arse end of nowhere. Well, Assail is probably also, but Jakaruku is that place that no one else cares about. It's exotic, it's out there, it's the old kingdom of Jakaruku and all that shit. When you read the Malazan Book of the Fallen, and you read most of the novels of the Malazan Empire, you read all of that stuff, Jakaruku almost never plays a role. It's almost mythical. No one cares about it. And what we're seeing here with Zayan having her vision, right, when she meets that leopard god, or is not a god, or whatever, that man leopard, and then sees the thaumaturg bring down something green out of the sky, and so forth, you realize that that's where the crippled god was called down from, right? That's sort of the lesson there. And why is this important? It is important because it shows us that while we may look at the more like Western, civilized, what have you, places of the world, even in the Malazan world, because, you know, when you look at the Malazan Book of the Fallen, the Bone Hunters, and everyone, they hang around in fairly civilized places. Genebakis is fairly civilized. Seven Cities is highly civilized. Letheras is highly civilized. They hang around in all these places that we as Westerners would consider either civilized or at least acceptable, because even when they go out into like the grasslands and in Dust of Dreams and whatnot, that's like mostly temperate, I guess, apart from say the jungles where the grey buggers go through, the grey wolves, grey shields, grey swords. That's them. Those bastards. That little bit of jungle, but apart from that, it's all like very, very average climate, whatever. And it's so easy to ignore, or so easy for us to accept that that's how fantasy should play out, and ignore the fact that the really, really important thing that happened made all of the rest of the Malazan stuff, or not all of the rest, but a lot of that stuff happen. A lot of that stuff, that like the catalyst that gets the whole ball rolling, actually happened in the place that you've always shrugged off as like unimportant because it's just this jungle continent over there that, where all those savages kneeled in their huts, in their grass huts, scratching their flea-ridden behinds, as a certain thaumaturg thinks it, right? So by writing that one novel about it and setting that event in that specific place, by that we kind of, and then writing all the other books about about stuff that happens somewhere else, we see that everything is connected, and we like basically performatively also get, through writing the novels and setting the novels in all these other places, both Esslemont and Erikson kind of show us that failing of us as civilized bastards to accept or even consider the fact that maybe it's not about us, and that maybe what actually will shape the fate of the world, will shape the fate of the universe, well, not the universe, but our planet and our species, is maybe happening someplace we kind of ignored because we were so stuck up with our own, grandeur, basically. So that's another thing that I feel is important to note about this novel, and about the whole setup. And I personally find that's really, really well done and interesting. All right. But wait, there's more. I want to have a quick look at a really more lighthearted part of it. Frankly, there's a lot like lighthearted, once again, like humorous scenes in this book. There's that like slight irony overshadowing both the parts of the Thaumaturg army, even though they're terrible, and other elements. But what I wanted to look at now is the Queen of Dreams showing up and declaring that she's not a goddess, which once again, it's this whole idea of like, when does an ascendant become a god? Is there a difference? And if so, what is it? We don't know. But we get us a bit of a parody of like monastic life, with the monastery, with the abbess being, she's fucked, because literally and then figuratively, when she realized that her goddess shows up. And then the whole thing, this is a comedy that we've seen before. It's a theme that has happened before, right? The idea that God or whatever deity shows up and realizes how far their worshippers have drifted from whatever they wanted to do in the beginnings. That idea, like Jesus says, be nice to each other, and then they come back and realize, oh shit, the Catholic Church has happened. That kind of joke or argument. I don't want to call it an argument, but the kind of joke that will then show how the hypocrisy or the cluelessness of organized religions is as old as organized religions, I suspect. You get it in your Satyricon if you go and read that one, which you totally should, because the Satyricon is one of the most funny books ever written, one of the funniest books ever written. You get it in your Boccaccio, right? In your Decameron, that's full of stories about priests behaving very unpriestly. Now, it's obviously not clear whether the abbess of the monastery of the Queen of Dreams is supposed to be celibate. I doubt that's the case. But we see more of it happening in other places, right? Later on, it's like their expectancy of how the goddess should look, how the goddess should behave, how the priests should behave, and so forth, are constantly challenged by the enchantress, Queen of Dreams, and well, she does have a name, but it's not been mentioned here, so I'll not bother you with it now. By her constantly defying that and doing her own thing, you have that idea that like they kind of ignored and almost sent away the fucking Segula because she wasn't dressed as a Segula. So you have that idea of like arrogance, even though that's not the job of monks and nuns or whatever you want to call them. That's the whole idea of that hypocrisy coming back home because it's constantly challenged and so forth is, well, it's a common theme, but it's nice to have that whole small episode slotted in there. Also, we have the Queen of Dreams, who's arguably one of my favorite ascendants in this whole universe. Show up, get a magical submarine, and drive off to somewhere, which, looking at the whole book, will probably also be Jakaruku and the abbess of the monastery not learning her lesson. That's the important bit there, right? Because when you read those stories about priests being unpriestly and whatnot, they usually never learn their lesson. It ends because most of those are either, well, most of them are just like parodies and jokes, but they never learn their fucking lesson. And it feels like she will probably also not learn her lesson. So yeah, that's just another thing that I wanted to put in there because I enjoyed that bit because, I enjoy jokes about religion. It's just the way I am. All right. One final thing. Tal and Princess, I forget her name, which is sad enough, right? The whole part there, the Jatal plotline with the warlord. Is he warlord? War leader. The war leader whom we, can safely assume is Kalor. There's two interesting things that go on there that I wanted to talk about. One of them is obviously the scene with the princess, her sneaking into his tent, and the discussion or non-discussion they have there, which shows, first of all, I mean, we know that Esslemont and Erickson have both been outspoken about all kinds of gender equality and feminism, right? But it's been rarely been that explicit as in that scene that when the princess is like, yeah, in some places, in some cultures, if a woman desires the same level of power and all of that as a man, she's considered a slut and a whore. But if a man does those kind of things and man takes whatever he wants, he's considered manly and virile and all of that. It's that's as open a criticism of the whole thing as you can get, because it's very much a description of Western society over the last couple of centuries, if not millennia. And the answer that yes, that must be a very small and frightened man is, well, yeah, it's true. That's sort of where that whole discussion, or that's where we are with that idea, is yeah, this is this is the patriarchy being afraid, which, yeah, I get it. And then there's a second additional interesting assessment there that I have, that Prince Jatal has, that I personally really enjoy, is that he's basically, the idea is that the summation of the male quandary is to constantly fear to be humiliated, because male identity, toxic masculinity basically is so much built on an image and about strength and whatnot, that humiliation, much more than any other form of pain, whatnot, humiliation is what most dudes are afraid of. And I guess part of the problem is in our world nowadays is what with the way everything has become even more public through social media and whatnot, that fear of humiliation has unfortunately spread to everyone these days. It may just be more deeply ingrained with guys than with the rest of the spectrum of genders, but it certainly is very much there. And it's important to understand that and to work on getting over that. I'm not saying be without shame. I'm saying don't think that humiliation is the worst enemy. There's things that are worth getting humiliated for because you stay true to yourself. And that's sort of what I think on that matter. Now, the other important thing that I wanted to look at is the scene with Jatal when they meet that slightly genetically altered, probably genetically altered kind of human that walks in circles to grind corn, right? And there's an important aspect about this. I mean, there's two of them. First, we learn that the Thaumaturgs, I mean, we kind of knew that before, the Thaumaturgs see humans as disposable assets and take them apart in on their road of science to make them as useful as possible, but they have no respect for what you might call human dignity, life, and whatnot. And through genetic engineering and weird medical, magical, whatever experiments, this is just made more clear than just through people taking away people's dignity through slavery and whatnot. It's basically, it's the same thing, just turned to 11. So we have that. And coming from a country with a not so good history when it comes to taking away people's dignity and subjecting them to medical experiments and shit, that strikes home for me, right? That it's hard for me to read that and not think Mengele. It's just saying. Is it a deliberate hint or reference towards what us Germans did in concentration camps? Probably not, but it is a hint at the same sort of mindset that we have, or we displayed, or some people displayed back there, by showing us that. There's two things happening there, and I once again want to, congratulate, two things. I want to congratulate Cam Esslemont for making it so clear through the way Jatal does that, because Jatal's a person that does a lot of self-reflection, which I applaud him for, even though he is still super stuck up in traditions and shit. Well, that's another point. But the situation is that we see something like that. We see someone treated like that person that was dehumanized in the worst possible ways. And what happens is we are revolted by it. We are revolted by it. Even our first impulse is to strike out and take away or destroy that person, even though that person, which is the important bit here, is the actual victim. They are the victim of something, and there's an element of body horror there, that we see something that has been human, or basically is a human being like us, and we see terrible things have been done to them, and they have become, once again, we come to that point of othering. They suddenly, forcefully become the other. So our first impulse is to strike out and take that thing away, to probably fight the fear that we have, that we might also suffer the same kind of thing. So by seeing that someone that is rationally a human being, but seeing those people turned into something that feels other, we have that situation that we feel insulted by their existence, because we know we're basically the same people, but this is so other, so maybe are we too? So there's that element of self-loathing that then turns into hatred and violence. And to actually go through all of that in Jatal's thoughts and reflections, I think is a very, very brave and very, smart and important thing to do, because we still tend to, it's one of those things, it's like when I look back at, my schoolyard days I was not a schoolyard bully. I was just regular most of the time. But when you look at human beings, especially at kids, right? Before we reach a certain level of awareness as humans, we just naturally do that. We see someone who's other than us, who's weaker than us, has, I don't know, any form of physically, like, visible disability or whatever. We just go in and bully them. We attack them. That's the problem with kids, right? Because you haven't learned that thing. And realizing that it is wrong to hurt, attack, or whatever, blame anyone for things that they didn't choose to do, for stuff that they are not, like, responsible for, is an act of civilization, an act of awareness and growing up. And that's something that we need to learn. And it's something that people have still not always learned. So having Jatal go through that in front of our eyes, like, or ears, depending on whether you listen or read, and realizing that he has this revulsion that he needs to overcome, and that the actual object of his hatred should be the people that did that, which in this case I said are the thaumaturgs, right? That is what I really appreciate about that scene, that we get that whole thought process of a grown-up person, like, not grown-up like in like age-wise, but like as a adult person with like all the necessary like brain power and awareness to do that. And it's important to see that actually go through him and see how everyone around him, like everyone in that situation, except obviously Calor, because Calor is a bastard, is fighting that revulsion and trying to overcome that like weird dichotomy between like that weird like transfer that goes on when we see someone that is so visibly different, or in this case even like, I mean, obviously the described case is just physically revolting for a lot of reasons, plus the fact that that person was made that way by another human being, which is even more revolting. Yeah, it's the kind of thing that makes you want to go and burn down places, which is not always wrong. That's what I'm saying here. But yeah, that's like the other part about that Jatal storyline that I personally really appreciated. So I feel like the last thing that we need to talk about, we've already been talking way too much. I had to recharge my camera in between and go to a meeting and talk about a festival, but here we are. The last thing we need to talk about today, the Osark Gothos discussion, which, I don't know, I just love Gothos. He's cool. Also, the idea that he's made to be a prick is obviously a good joke. But yeah, the question is like, and there's like, that kind of goes back to something that we have right at the beginning that I also didn't talk about. Is like, why are we in specific places? Is there such a thing as fate? As says, where Shimmer's like, no, I don't believe in that bullshit. And then we have, like, on the other hand, Osirk talking to Gotha's like, I think you're here because you're here at your own choice. Like, yeah, of course, it's my choices that brought me here, but like, that's sort of the point. Is like, there are things happening in the world, and it's up to us how we react to them, how we, what we do, what we choose. It's our choices. The question is, how much agency do we have in those choices, and how much is there a situation where the outside world, with all of the events and so forth, possibly events that we have set in motion ourselves because we didn't understand what we were doing at the time. But is there a point where our range of options, of choices, is narrowed down so far that it feels like destiny, that it feels like fate, that we have only one further outcome? And Kaaz seems to imply that at the beginning to Shimmer, whereas at the end, Gothos is like, you know what? Those are all your choices, and you're to blame. That's the only person to be blamed. Now the question is, obviously, and we'll talk about that way further on, is like, does Kaaz actually know the same thing and is just trying to kind of get out of this sort of like the personal responsibility or the pain that realizing that you fucked up ages ago and you still have to live with the consequences kind of thing? Is that what is like helping him to maybe, or like tempting him to flee into the claim that there is such a thing as fate and that you sometimes have no choice? Well, that's a question for another day, and we'll talk about that maybe tomorrow, maybe sometime next week. I don't know. Until then, have a great bloody Thanksgiving if you are celebrating that kind of thing. Apart from like all the problems with that day, don't get killed on Black Friday tomorrow. Thank you, all of you, for being here, listening to me ramble, all that stuff. I really, really appreciate it. If you still, if you're still here, please like, subscribe, do the good things, and I'll talk to you about something else real soon. And until then, cheers.